I want to kick us off with our State of the World this year. You know, it's an intense time. As for me, with last week, the United Nations General Assembly meetings, yesterday, the state funeral, just extraordinary to be able to participate in that last event with the former Prime Minister. And of course, today, in addition to being here for the summit, I'm also devastating the state of Florida, apparently, with a hurricane by my name. I have no idea why that's happening. I apologize. I don't have anything against Florida. And so I wanted to start with this idea of, can one person change the world? On February 24th of this year, Vladimir Putin gave us an answer to that question. The invasion of Ukraine that he ordered, to the surprise of many of his own generals, opened a conflict that is shifting international politics. It's roiling the global economy. It's remaking relations between East and West, as well as West and Global South, for years and perhaps generations to come. This still expanding conflict, and make no doubt it's getting worse right now, not better, was and continues to be the design of one man. But its effects have upended lives and livelihoods in every region of our still very interconnected GZERO world. I want to open with some thoughts on the changes that this horrible war has wrought. But there are much larger questions to consider, and the biggest of all centers on the entire international system. I want to address what comes next, where all of this is going. So our world is plagued with crises that are coming much more often and much more abruptly. And it's obvious that the current system, and in many cases our individual governments, are not yet equipped to respond. In particular, the United States, the world's most powerful nation, is also today the most politically divided and dysfunctional democracy of all the G7 countries. Further, relations between the United States, still the world's superpower, and its most important emerging actor, China, are bad and getting worse. They're barely talking at all. But in the final part of my speech, I want to explain how, despite these two critical obstacles to progress, U.S. dysfunction and growing U.S.-China confrontation, that I still see real opportunity for positive change, particularly in areas where multiple actors around the world have real influence over what comes next. But I open with Putin's war, and we have to begin with its awful implications for Ukraine. Despite Ukraine's remarkable recent progress on the battlefield, this war continues to threaten its survival as a nation. Russia controls about 20% still of Ukraine's territory, and though Ukraine's forces have launched a counteroffensive that has recaptured ground and shows promise, they are unlikely to ever evict Russians fully. This week, Vladimir Putin's government is preparing to annex much of this occupied land, about 15% of Ukrainian territory, into the Russian Federation. Completely fake news. Ukraine's economy will probably contract by about 40% this year. And international aid, which has been extraordinary, will absolutely help the government pay its employees, including its soldiers, and finance its bid to continue to defend themselves. but Russia's gains will permanently reduce Ukraine's GDP and long-term growth potential. I believe that Ukraine will survive. Its process of integration into the European Union will keep the effort to rebuild and reform Ukraine's economy on track. But with no end to the fighting in sight, Ukraine will need to remain fully mobilized for this war. Its economy will continue to suffer. Western commitment to Ukraine over time will surely diminish. I don't want that, but I think we have to recognize the likelihood. U.S. and European military support will not likely continue at present levels beyond the next 12 to 24 months. And that reality will ultimately undermine President Zelensky's ability to negotiate an end to the war that's acceptable to Ukrainians who have already lost so much. And that is going to be Ukraine's biggest long-term political problem. Despite confidence in Kiev that the war can still be won, whatever that means, the near-term goal will remain survival and a better day in the long-term future. But now I want to turn to Russia. And I want to be very, very clear. For Russia's future, the war in Ukraine is a catastrophe. For Putin, it is increasingly a matter of survival. And Vladimir Putin's unwillingness to accept this reality has made the problem much worse and global. President Putin intends to declare victory at some point, perhaps once Russia annexes enough of Ukraine's land to make the claim credible inside Russia. But one of Russia's stated goals when the invasion began was that he wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. And instead, Ukrainian forces have now proven that Russia is not strong enough to accomplish that. Indeed, Ukraine will remain better armed and much more fully integrated with NATO forces and leadership, and much more determined to defend its independence than was imaginable before the February invasion. Last week, Putin announced the mobilization of up to 300,000 reservists, something he had been hoping not to have to do. He knows how unpopular it's going to be at home. And eventually, that will likely matter for the balance of power on the ground. But it's going to take months to train and equip all these people for combat. If he goes faster, they won't have the equipment or the capacity to fight. President Putin also hoped to divide America and Europe, to weaken NATO's cohesion and its sense of purpose. Once again, he has accomplished exactly the opposite. The U.S. and Europe have not worked as closely together on any issue since the end of the Cold War, as we are seeing today. NATO is in the process of expanding to include Finland and Sweden, strengthening the alliance's capabilities and instantly doubling the length of its borders with Russia. Germany is sharply increasing its defense spending. Putin has managed to provide even America's Republicans and Democrats with an enemy that they hate even more than each other. That's not easy to do. Russia now faces hundreds of thousands of forward-deployed battle forces, ready at a time when its military is struggling to recover from the loss of tens of thousands of its soldiers and a staggering amount of its firepower that it cannot rebuild. Sanctions and export controls at unprecedented levels have tied Russia's military supply chains in knots. More broadly, Russia's economy is in dire trouble. It's true that high commodity prices and the government's ability to temporarily bolster the ruble, as well as Europe's continued dependence on Russian energy and the willingness of countries like China and India to continue to buy unsanctioned energy exports at heavily discounted prices, about 30% lower than the market, that's cushioned the near-term blow for Russia's people. They're going to contract by 5% this year. They had been one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, but they can handle 1 year of that. But Russia's president has proven to European leaders that they can never again trust him as a reliable commercial partner. Russia is not coming back. They know that they have to absorb considerable pain in the coming months to deny Moscow the ability to punish Europe again in the future. And once they have stopped buying Russian energy altogether, which is probably in 2024, it will be Russia that faces lasting changes. As long as Putin remains in power, there will be no reason for the US and EU to lift sanctions. In fact, we're going to see an 8th round of sanctions supported unanimously by all 27 EU countries next month. It's no surprise, given all of this, that many of Russia's most ambitious and talented young people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, are not being mobilized for the front, but instead are getting out of the country, trying to find a better life. At this stage, we're left to wonder whether Putin understands the depth of the hole that he has continued to dig for himself and for his country. His security forces, of course, have suppressed almost all public displays of dissent. Ordinary Russians know that participation in protests leaves them at the mercy of a police that have a mandate to abuse them. Even public use of the word war in Russia subjects you to prison for up to 15 years. But the successful crackdown on protests risks numbing his government to the pain and lasting danger of growing public anger, and it is there. Putin does understand that public resistance is a danger. That's why he's waited for so long to make this announcement of the mobilization. He surely knows that the true costs of the war in Russian lives and in long-term economic damage cannot be hidden for long. In short, Putin had hoped to strengthen Russia, to boost the country's prestige on the global stage, and to replenish public confidence in his leadership. It is increasingly obvious, even to ordinary Russians, that what he has accomplished is exactly the opposite. The war's impact on the West has been nearly as dramatic. For those of us who came of age in a time of Cold War, it is startling to realize that the Berlin Wall fell 1/3 of a century ago. Since then, Americans and Europeans have come to believe that the wall and the East-West conflict that it symbolized can be relegated to the history books. One of NATO's early leaders famously said back in the 50s that the purpose of the NATO alliance was, and I quote, to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Since 1992, a European might reasonably ask why any of that remained necessary. The Soviets were consigned to the dustbin of history. NATO continued, of course, but its purpose became a subject of debate. You'll remember Trump said it was obsolete. Macron said it was brain dead. Americans and Europeans could be free to focus on their differences rather than their common values, their interests, and their threats. On February 24th, Putin brought that era to an end. Russia's invasion threatens other countries that are now EU members and transforms European perceptions of Moscow's destructive potential. It reveals the continuing value of both security partnership with Washington and Germany's willingness to spend much more on collective defense. NATO is once again essential, and G7 leaders, including here in Japan, have new problems to solve, new plans to make. Washington, Brussels, and London are in near lockstep on efforts that both punish Russia and degrade its military and economic capabilities. The pandemic and its economic fallout has bolstered unity within the EU and the need for collective action to bolster European security, to fundamentally redesign Europe's energy architecture, to boost Ukraine's firepower and absorb Ukraine's millions of refugees, have all added momentum to that movement. And frankly, even Italy's new far-right government, led by Madame Meloni, that'll come together soon, backs the EU effort to bolster Zelensky's government in Kiev. And through the accession process, it's a long and winding road, but nonetheless a unanimous vote to accept Ukraine and Moldova as candidates for union membership, which embraces the Russian invasion as a European war, speaks volumes for just how far we've come over the course of 7 months. None of this was possible before February 24th. All of it is the direct result of the mistake of simply one man. And as obvious here in Japan, this is not just a story about Europe. Russia's war boosted security concerns for all advanced industrial democracies. With a nervous glance towards Beijing, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand can see that what's happening inside Ukraine and inside Russia is also directly relevant to Asia's security. And this gives these countries new reason to renew their security partnerships with the American military superpower. In short, Russia's war in Ukraine has created the crisis needed to bring unity where there had been only fragmentation and GZERO in recent years. The positive effects of this shock will be felt far into the future. And yet, as we turn to a broader look at the current state of the world, and I want to get much farther than the Russian war momentarily, we have to recognize that that war has also added to the health and economic and social and political stresses that were all caused by 2 years of pandemic to create even more turmoil in those developing countries around the world that are least capable of shouldering that burden. The breakdown of global supply chains, the higher food and fuel prices that are exacerbated by the war, and the growing debt burdens all of this imposes on the cash-poor governments of middle and lower income countries. That's created turmoil and in some cases state collapse already this year. They will do much more in 2023. It's no exaggeration to say that the developing world's globalization gains of recent decades, first among them the creation of a truly global middle class, have now been thrown into reverse, first by COVID and then by the Kremlin. With that warning, I want to turn to a broader and longer-term question. What will replace our GZERO world order? The continuing lack of credible and sustainable international leadership. What comes next? Because the last 50 years of international economic development have all been defined by globalization, this idea that information, people, money, goods, and services cross borders faster and faster at unprecedented speed. And globalization has generated an economic era on a scale of growth, on a scale that has been unmatched in human history. Yes, profit and opportunities for multinational corporations and financials, and many of whom are in the room today, but also it lifted billions of people out of poverty and created for the first time a global middle class. It has, of course, also created losers. We talk about this a lot. Workers in wealthy countries who haven't been part of the transition towards knowledge-based jobs in the 21st century digital economy. American and European factory workers in particular, we've seen all of those stories, have gained much less than their peers in emerging countries. And they've come to resent what they call the globalism, an ideological faith that the positive power of universal interconnectedness that allows wealthy and powerful elites to write rules that benefit themselves. And politicians looking for opportunity recognize this backlash, and they've invented ways to profit from it. The result is a pushback in countries around the world against liberal international trade and the promotion of social values that they see as alien to traditional culture. We see this in bitter opposition the American left expressed towards almost all proposed trade deals. We see it in the tribalism that now drives the Trump faction of the Republican America First Party. We see it in every reference that Britain's Liz Truss or Italy's Giorgia Meloni make to woke culture and the anti-capitalist rhetoric that animated the French left during elections earlier this year. We also increasingly see it in low and middle income countries as well. Xi Jinping's insistence on Chinese self-reliance, Vladimir Putin's appeal to Russian Orthodox values as a shield against the liberal Western fetish for personal freedom and degradation. That's why the new global buzzword is one I really don't like: decoupling. We've all heard decoupling. This aspiration for separation is the natural consequence of a my country first ideology, one that plays on both legitimate worries and nativist grievances to reject the idea that interdependence as human beings is good for security and prosperity. And in this view, safety can be found only in self-reliance, and outside influences are to be defiantly resisted. But unlike globalization, which is a word that describes a single broad phenomenon, there's actually not just one thing that decoupling is. There are three separate decouplings that are happening in the world right now. And they're not going to end globalization. I want to be very clear about that. But rather, they will fracture the global economy, and they will change our geopolitical order. The first, I've talked about a bit. It separates Russia from the West. It's the most abrupt of the three. It's the most severe. It's clearly the most irreversible. Because the most important lasting implication of Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be the near complete severing of economic ties between Russia and the world's advanced industrial economies. We have seen Russia's business elite, assets frozen, banks under sanction, cut out of the financial system. Europe has finally come to accept that Russia won't produce energy for them. This decoupling is near complete. It is functionally permanent. Russia's not entirely isolated. They'll still buy weapons from Iran and North Korea, not the best partners on that front. Its natural resources are too important to the global economy. China and India will keep buying. The developing world will buy fertilizer too. But the long-term impact on Russia that follows its decoupling from the West will be staggering. Its access to technologies will be limited, with dire implications for Russian industry and the country's increasingly broken military. The result of all of this is a new Cold War with elements of hot war. But unlike the conflict of the 20th century, this one will unite rather than divide Europe. The second decoupling separates the West and the global South. As we move deeper into the 21st century with all of the crises that we see in front of us today, U.S.-China frictions and Russia's war will keep East-West conflict in the headlines. But the emerging points of contention between West and global South will pose important threats and challenges. Continuing interdependence leave the United States and China in the same boat towards a common destination. More on that in a second. But unfortunately, many poorer developing countries, especially vulnerable to the world's political and economic turmoil, and a source of millions of migrants and refugees desperate to escape, will find over the next decade that they don't even have seats on lifeboats. The global pandemic has already pushed indebted, poor countries into dangerous territory. Some 58% of the world's poorest countries are already in debt distress or at high risk of it. The World Bank warned us in June that this danger is now spreading to middle-income countries. Broken supply chains, rising interest rates, surging inflation, all combine with falling growth and fewer remittances from wealthy countries to create conditions for a developing world debt crisis in coming years. Russia's war has added price volatility for the food and fuel that slows rich world economies, but it devastates poorer ones. Finally, poorer countries are less well prepared to limit the harm done by erratic weather patterns and other unpredictable results of continuing climate change. 30% of Pakistan presently underwater, vastly worse than what you'll see in wealthy countries. And that is going to add to the already catastrophic humanitarian, political, and economic storms that are created by mass flows of migrants. That's especially true in South Asia, in North Africa, and the Middle East, where surging temperatures often test the limits of human endurance, and in Central America, a region already plagued with poverty and violent crime. Wealthier countries will increasingly respond to these same crises with steps mainly designed to protect their own populations rather than invest in the common good. Concerns about high inflation and recession in America and Europe are already limiting political appetites for expensive investments in emergency management and debt restructuring in other regions that are absolutely essential. Investments and plans to limit climate change will focus on disasters and dislocated people at home. And Western-led institutions like the IMF and the World Bank will have to make very tough choices on where to invest limited dollars made increasingly scarce by how many more emergencies are coming to them. India, now projected to become the world's most populous country next year, will align with the United States and its Asian allies to contain China's expanding influence in security. But on all of the emergencies that I just described, it falls squarely in the global south. How will Prime Minister Modi's government respond in coming years to the many economic challenges his country will face? How will Brazil, how will South Africa, Indonesia? These are incremental changes. None can afford to break their relations with the U.S. and the West, but they are all increasingly tilting towards populism and protectionism to bolster their political support at home. It is an incremental decoupling. And that leads us to the third and final decoupling, which is that between the United States and China. For now, the Biden administration has very little choice but to spend much of its time focused on the war in Ukraine. But it's not the Kremlin that's challenging U.S. power by becoming more economically influential and becoming more technologically dynamic. That's China. It's China's growing clout, its rising hostility towards U.S. influence that has many of America's policymakers and pundits, Democrats and Republicans, pointing that political finger, warning about Beijing. It's incredibly unfortunate that that's happening. We don't want the world's most important bilateral relationship consisting of countries with political and economic systems that are misaligned, with policymakers that do not trust each other. It's even more unfortunate that the pragmatism that had allowed for decades the United States and China to profit enormously from each other through globalization has broken down into acrimony, has broken down into distrust. In America today, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much, but leaders in both parties insist that China poses global threats that must be contained. In China, political leaders argue the only way to overcome U.S. containment strategies is to undermine U.S. power where possible. And that's why, in both countries, the idea of decoupling has only become more popular presently. Washington wants to spur strategic investment in semiconductors, not just to expand growth, but also to beat the Chinese. Chinese remarkable investments in renewable energy push the Americans to go greener faster as a battle for market dominance. In both countries, sectors with national security importance, which in China includes social media and other information industries, are off limits to potentially valuable investment from the other. There is better news here. As I said, these are incremental changes. The West decoupling with Russia is near absolute, while U.S.-China decoupling is far more limited. It's true that trust between Washington and Beijing is in no supply, but at the same time, U.S. and Chinese leaders know that problems much closer to home are going to occupy their attention in coming years. And as a consequence of that, they will be working on trade more closely than the headlines would make you believe. There remains a consensus within the U.S. government that America still needs China's economy to remain strong. A dangerously destabilized China still leads to mutually assured economic destruction. The Biden administration recognizes that high inflation in the U.S. is exacerbated by tariffs on China, that the problem would grow worse if the U.S. even signaled the intention to decouple, and that's why Biden doesn't do it. In fact, when Biden meets with Xi Jinping, as is almost certain, in November at the G20, he will probably talk about trying to reduce some of these Trump tariffs. And if he does, whatever the rhetoric, Beijing is likely to welcome the opening. Because there's similar pragmatism underneath the headlines in China, too. Xi would be happy to see Vladimir Putin damage Western confidence, but he also sees that Russia's headstrong president and his war have failed. Putin indeed has brought the transatlantic partners closer together and raised fears over Taiwan that have America and their Asian allies closer, not farther apart. This is bad for China. And she knows the Communist Party's monopoly hold on domestic political power depends on continuing to meet the expectations of China's people for a continuously rising standard of living. And that depends on robust trade relations with Japan, with the EU, with the United States, which together buy 40% of China's exports. By the way, China's economy has been growing over Xi Jinping's rule. That 40%, almost the same, stays consistent. You know how much it's with Russia? 2%. That tells you a lot. China remains America's largest trade partner in goods, its largest supplier of goods imports, its third largest export market. The U.S. is China's largest goods trade partner and biggest export market. I think that will still be true in 5 years' time, even in 10 years' time. Business elites in both countries continue to protect the opportunities that U.S.-Chinese commercial ties in most fields continue to create. And as important, maybe even more, other governments, even those most fearful of China's rise, even those most resentful of America's sometimes arrogant use of power, want the U.S. and China to compete peacefully and for the benefit of the entire global economy. They want no part of a new potential Cold War between the Americans and the Chinese. As a consequence, 21st century interdependence cannot be undone by 20th century Cold War-style threats. We will see a decoupling in tech and security sectors that will intensify, but the interdependence will bind countries together. And that's why, though globalization faces unprecedented stress tests, it would be foolish to bet against the long-term potential to generate more gains for those who participate in it. In other words, globalization today is not over, nor is it being destroyed. Globalization is adrift. That's not an exciting headline, but that's where we are. And if I point to the Trump administration or the Biden administration, I can show you things the Americans have done that have led to less globalization, and I've showed you things that have led to more. But no one's leading the bus. No one's driving. Okay, so final section here. Given all of that, these three decouplings that are happening, that are no longer driving globalization, that is the system that we've all enjoyed and benefited from, what comes next? What comes after this GZERO? What does it all mean for the future of the global order? First is the bad news. The United States, the world's still most powerful country, is only becoming politically more divided and dysfunctional. I'd love to tell you that I soon see a brighter day ahead for American politics. I don't. Left-right differences in worldview are too entrenched. Policy positions are too polarized. I don't think that's going to change. Nor will U.S.-China relations improve much in coming years. Yes, economic and political self-interest in both countries will prevent a total breakdown in the relationship, but frictions are increasing, not decreasing. Bipartisan U.S. hostility towards China, a surge of Chinese nationalism stoked by the Communist Party, tech competition, politics of the pandemic, and Russia, they've all worked to minimize the possibility that a new U.S.-China alignment will help provide the world with better collective leadership. So we can't count on that one either. But I said there's good news. What's the good news? If there's not going to be a G1 or a G2 to replace the GZERO, what's the good news? Well, first big point. When you have a world that is run by one or two superpowers, they set the agenda, the entire agenda, and they make the rules in every important arena of the international system. You have one global order, for better and for worse. But what happens when the world isn't led by superpowers anymore? We've never had that. Turns out that tomorrow's geopolitics will not be based on a single global order anymore. Instead, on multiple coexisting orders with different actors providing leadership, managing different types of challenges. This is the way out of the GZERO dilemma that we've been living with now for more than a decade. Let's start with the global security order, because that's the one area of international relations that actually isn't changing very much. The United States remains the only country on earth that can project military power into every region of the world, outspending the next 9 countries on defense combined. Despite China's much greater investment in their naval capacity and a growing willingness to use it in this part of the world, in East and Southeast Asia, America's hard power has no serious global rival. For now, China remains a regional military power. And ironically, Putin's invasion has bolstered American security power by reminding Europe just how valuable that transatlantic alliance can be. I said NATO has expanded, not because America wants it to, but because Russia and Putin persuaded them they have to. America's Asian allies are also looking to strengthen military ties with Washington. China's bellicose foreign policy rhetoric on the security side have teeth on edge, from Japan and South Korea through India to Australia. None of these countries want China as an enemy, not one, none of them. All want to profit from commercial opportunities that China can offer, just as the Europeans do. But all are too wary of a deep dependence on Beijing's goodwill. All want to keep American military power in the region. Russia will actively push against this security order, but its reckless and self-destructive war, the unified Western response to it, and the economic implications have so damaged the Russian military that it will take decades to rebuild. In fact, in years to come, I would argue that Russia is more likely to behave like a large Iran, a rogue state, than an aspiring China. As its economy falls apart, it will have to build the kind of intensified police state that we presently see in Belarus. It will look for new ways to destabilize Europe and the United States, much as Iran does via proxies in the Middle East. Talk to the Saudis and Emiratis about Iran. They don't talk about nukes. They talk about drone strikes and cyber. They talk about radicalism and terrorism. They talk about disinformation. But Iran is what has unified the Middle East, the Abraham Accords. That's what the world will be saying about Russia. And just as Putin has done in recent days, he's going to use nuclear threats to try to blunt Western responses. Who's going to lead the response? Washington. That's the security order. Sounds more familiar than you might have thought. Now let's turn to the global economic order. It's a completely different story. Though there's little reason to doubt the resilience of the United States, we see the dollar at 20-year highs. Vis-a-vis the UK, it's at 200-year highs. I didn't think we had data for 200 years, frankly. But this is an area where we're moving away from a unipolar world toward a multipolar world. And there are different models that are plausible. If China does indeed become the world's largest economy over the next 10 years, as still looks likely, and it extends its economic lead over time, Chinese investment abroad and international demand for access to the Chinese market will ensure a more multilateral trade order. America's push for strategic competition will be tempered by hedging of everyone, the European allies, the Asian allies, the Middle Eastern allies, to say nothing of the American private sector inside the U.S. itself. A Chinese alignment will then have most, but not all, of the developing world. I'm not confident that's the way it plays out. It could also be that China's very poor demographics, much worse than we see in Japan or South Korea, and much poorer, as well as their large and growing debt load, especially on the corporate side, growing inequality and protectionism in the developed and developing worlds, might well stall Chinese growth to a far greater degree. China might not become the largest economy in the world. If it does, it might only be that for 5 or 10 years. That would stall China. It would force the policymakers to turn inward. Their Belt and Road Initiative would wither, and dominant regional powers around the world would then become the most important players on trade. The U.S., of course, would still be economically dynamic in that model, but so would the EU and India and Brazil, and many others would form rules and standards and trade blocs to continue to help fuel global growth. And further, the European Union, as a single entity, will continue to exercise important leadership on the setting of standards and the writing of rules that create boundaries for 21st century commerce. The climate order is completely different. It's not being led at all by the United States and Chinese governments, even though those are the two that are doing the most, responsible for the most emissions. And that's highly unlikely to change in coming years. The climate order will be determined by a much more diverse set of actors, countries and non-state actors, all of whom now face a universally recognized and accepted common problem. In short, the climate effort has already become multipolar and multi-stakeholder in ways that should give us more confidence about a more resilient future. European leaders have set the pace on rulemaking and model setting for how a post-carbon world of governance and society can function. And yet, though damage to the Earth's atmosphere has so far been a product of industrial development in Europe and America, it's the developing world that will play the largest role, China and India, in determining the level of emissions in coming decades, and therefore just how much damage human beings will ultimately inflict on the planet that we all share. Crucially, this is also a struggle in which non-state actors, the United Nations, other international organizations, the global scientific community, philanthropic organizations, provincial and local political leaders, multinational corporations and banks, activist organizations, and even influential individuals all have played a genuinely substantive role in advancing the international effort to reverse the damage that humans have done and will continue to do to the planet. This multi-stakeholder order will remain in effect whether we can limit climate change to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which looks increasingly impossible, or whether actors focus on more narrow, short-term concerns, pushing global temperatures higher to 2.5 or more, as looks likely. The difference between these outcomes, I know, is a matter of tens of trillions of dollars and hundreds of millions of lives. But whatever the trajectory, the global climate order, unlike security, unlike trade, will be a dramatically more multipolar and more multi-stakeholder model than has ever existed in modern times. And finally, last, there is the digital order, the biggest departure from the geopolitics of our past. The United States and allies equipped with weapons can still dominate the battlefields in the physical world. Power in the digital world is completely different. Here, the United States and China are still the dominant players, but actually not as government actors, and that's critical. Instead, it's the world's largest technology companies who have sovereignty and rule-making power in the virtual world. That's true for commerce, it's true for security, it's even true for civil society. This is what I call the technopolar world. Nearly all the powerful tech companies are headquartered in just two countries, the United States and China. But whether the technopolar order evolves into a technology Cold War, an open or competitive multipolar global order, or breaks down into completely separate technology company-driven virtual worlds, which sounds deeply dystopian, completely depends on whether the governance models of these companies evolve and how they choose to interact with governments over the coming years. Example, if the US and Chinese political leaders assert themselves effectively in the digital space, and if the tech companies based in those two countries line up with their respective governments, a US-China technology Cold War becomes likely. But if the tech companies continue to pursue global growth strategies and refuse to align with individual governments, preserving the existing divide in the physical and digital fields of competition, then we'll see a more multipolar, globalist digital order. And then finally, if the digital space itself becomes the most important arena of great power competition, and if the power of governments continues to erode as it has in the last 10 years relative to the power of tech companies, then the digital order itself will become the new dominant global order. And if that happens, we're going to have to consider an entirely new set of actors. The technology companies become the central actors in 21st century geopolitics. So that's my view, a state of the world, and more importantly, a state of where I think we're heading. It's enormously exciting and enormously worrying. But the thing that really inspires is that even with the dysfunction on the global order today, even with the crises that are in front of us, what that necessitates is a fragmentation that empowers more people, empowers more institutions, empowers more companies, and more governments. Japan, people in this room are going to have so much more to say about the futures of these orders that are less competitive than they are coexisting. And for most of our existence on the planet, before superpowers existed, it was about coexistence. It wasn't about great power geopolitics and fighting in Thucydides' traps. I think in some ways, history is repeating. It's an exciting time to be here. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I'm looking forward to spending a little bit of time over the rest of the day. I hope we have a great summit, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Thanks.